what are all of the techniques that Yuta had copied for his fight against Sukuna? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. Alright, so shout out to Just Jones who asked me about this and wanted to know what techniques Yuta might have had but just didn't get a chance to use. And I think we could pretty much narrow this down based on what we do know. So first of all, let's talk about all of the ones that Yuta did have and use in his fight with Sukuna. And conveniently, Sukuna goes through a little list right here as he's trying to prepare for what he might have to face against Yuta. And as you can see, he lists Angel's Jacob's Ladder technique, a space manipulation technique, which we know to be Uro's technique, a technique that can create an inviolable barrier on the path of his Shikigami, which was Drew's technique, cursed speech, which is of course Inumaki's technique, and finally clairvoyance, which was Charles's technique, the mangaka. But in addition to those, we know that Yuta also had Shrine thanks to Yuji. Now we also know that Rika must consume a part of a person in order to use their technique, and that person can't heal that injury, otherwise Yuta will lose access to the technique. Like we see here with Charles, where they had Rika eat one of his ribs, and he's like, I'm gonna get that back later, right? So obviously for any technique that Yuta needed, it either needed to come from somebody that was already injured and they had their body part, or from somebody that really wasn't gonna participate in the fight anyway. So knowing that, let's take a look at our potential candidates here. And everyone in this image was heavily involved in the fight against Sukuna, which means that Yuta probably wasn't going to take their techniques anyway because they needed to use them, right? Now, obviously, in the case of somebody like Yuji, he did copy Shrine and Yuji was still able to use Shrine, but he only ate like a pinky finger, right? Or whatever finger it was. And that was really just more so to surprise Sukuna. He wasn't trying to get a lot of use cases out of Shrine. But again, for the other primary combatants here, he would have either gotten like a tiny use of the technique, which would have been useless, or if he had taken enough of them, they wouldn't have been able to participate themselves, right? And then for people like Kusakabe and Maki, they obviously don't have techniques. And then Hikari and Higuruma, how would that even work since their techniques are tied to their domains? So really, Ino might have been the only person he could have copied here, but again, since Ino was participating, probably wasn't one that he did. So that means our prime candidates here are going to be people that were part of their group, but that just didn't fight. And we pretty much have all of them in this panel here in the auditorium where they were planning for the Sukuna fight. So let's run through them really quick. And most of these people are people from the previous image who we've already talked about. So I'm not going to go over them again. But the first one to mention here would be Noritoshi Kamo. We know that he wasn't really game to throw down with Sukuna, so he didn't participate. Yuta could have taken one of his ribs to get a little bit of blood manipulation, but that wasn't really necessary because Choso and Yuji already had blood manipulation on lock for this fight. Plus, Rika did eat Yuji's finger, so Yuta might have even had a little bit of blood manipulation he could have used. Next, we have Kashimo, which he obviously wasn't going to copy that technique. Then we've got Hikari and Kirara next to him. We already talked about Hikari. Kirara's technique, he maybe could have eaten a rib to gotten a little bit of that, but I don't really know how that would have been relevant. Plus, Kirara, while they weren't fighting, was a critical part of like the rescue team with Ui, so probably wasn't on the radar to take their technique. Then we have Momo, which is the broom girl. Could have taken that, but I don't know how relevant it would have been in the fight against Sukuna just to be hovering around, so probably didn't bother. Next to Momo up there, we have, I can't remember his name, the guy from Shibuya that can pause injuries. And again, he wasn't a combatant, but he was a critical part of the medical team with Shoko, so Yuta probably didn't take that so that he would have full access to his own technique, plus pausing injuries in the midst of a battle probably wouldn't help too much since Yuta knows RCT himself anyway. And then we've got everybody on this side, Higuruma, who we've already talked about, Angel, who we've already talked about. That's Yuta himself. Then Maki, Inumaki, and Panda. We've talked about them. Panda, Yuta's not going to take anything from him. So that leaves us finally with the people on the far right side of the room over there, which is the adults. So Shoko, Urahime, and Ichichi. Shoko doesn't have a technique. Ijichi, I don't think does. He was just doing like barrier techniques and stuff, so also irrelevant. That leaves us with Urahime, whose technique boosts other people's techniques by like dancing around, which wasn't going to have a use case in the midst of the fight with Sukuna. And then finally, not pictured in either of those panels, we would have Todo and Meimei, who would also have been a part of the good guy roster, as it were. We know that Todo had a very important role, so his probably wasn't on the table. Meimei also had an important role with her ravens and swapping with Todo, but I feel like since she wasn't an active participant, he could have theoretically copied her technique, but she probably wouldn't wouldn't have let him. So with all that being the case, I think the techniques we actually saw him use were probably the only ones that Akotsu had access to. And then I also wanted to address Jones's second question, which is, what if the humans who have techniques but can't use them are people who have access to cursed energy in general? Like someone like Kusakabe could have a curse technique they can't use, but if Mahito were to idle transfiguration him, he'd be able to access it. So what Jones is talking about is people like Higuruma or Junpei, where they actually were born with the curse technique, but they weren't born with the correct bodies to actually utilize it. So Mahito idle transfigured Junpei to give him access to his technique, and we know that Kenjaku used idle transfiguration on a bunch of people to set off the culling games, like Higuruma. So I don't think that it's just people that can have a natural affinity for cursed energy who are like a Junpei or are like a Higuruma, because for all intents and purposes, Higuruma, before he was activated, didn't have an awareness of cursed energy, nor was he using it in his everyday life. It was only after the fact that he gained an awareness of those things. Meaning somebody like Kusakabe, who is really well versed in cursed energy but just doesn't have a curse technique, I don't think that speaks to his likelihood of secretly being born with a technique like a Higuruma or like a Junpei or anything. I think it could be true, but it's not necessarily true. Then next up, I've gotten a couple of follow-up questions on some videos I put out last week, starting with this one from Sam, which is in response to our video where we talked about just how Kenjaku body swapped. Is there a brain transplant involved, or does it work some other way? And Sam says, I believe Kenjaku converts himself into a cursed object, then feeds or plants that into the next person, the same way that Sukuna transferred over to Megami. This would explain two things. First, how he was able to do it alone, and second, how he knew to convert into cursed objects in the first place. Additionally, I don't think it's a complete brain transplant because your brain has your curse technique, so some part of the target's brain must be intact. So first, it could 100% be this. My only pushback on some of this is that I don't think it needs to be, I don't think his curse technique is the same thing as creating a cursed object. So I don't think whatever he does is the same thing that that Sukuna did to Megami. But I do certainly think that whatever Kenjaku's technique is what led him to find out how to turn yourself into a cursed object. Because Kenjaku has this unique experience of transferring body to body, that's the only way he was able to develop the cursed object thing. But the reason I don't think it's the exact same is because we know he does have a curse technique that is body swapping. That's his technique. So it doesn't seem to be that just if it was just the creation of cursed objects, then there would be no curse technique involved, if that makes sense. And we know that there is. Again, that being said, though, the curse technique itself could manifest by him feeding his brain to the next person or something. We don't know exactly how it works still. So it could still be something along those lines. But then about the technique, meaning some of the target's brain must be there because we know techniques are engraved on the brain. That is true, but it's not the only way, right? Because we know that curse techniques, the language used has also been engraved on the body. And we know that Yuji got Sukuna's curse technique engraved on his body, even though Sukuna's brain was never literally present in Yuji's body, right? So it's nebulous how that exactly works, but I don't think it's a requirement that Kenjaku's target's brains are still there. They very well could be, but I don't think they have to be. And then on Kenjaku, I also got sent in this theory from James, and y'all should pause to read the whole thing because it's a great write-up, where he's essentially saying that Yuji's origin is not a coincidence, and it's perhaps the result of his most deliberately constructed experiment, and that before possessing Yuji's mother, he would have also known that Yuji's grandfather was the reincarnated twin, and he wasn't creating Yuji just to be a vessel for Sukuna, but instead perhaps as an experiment to rejoin the two halves of Sukuna's soul, to see what that would actually do, correcting destiny in that way. And I think this is a really cool idea, and I do think there's some excellent themes there, but I don't think it's what his actual plan was, just based on what we actually got in the story and a few lines from him at various points. I do think that Yuji was just a suitable vessel to contain Sukuna and bring him into the modern age. I think what James is saying is incredibly poetic here, and it could be a meta-level analysis that was intended, but I just don't think it was Kenjaku Kenjaku's actual plan within the narrative, because as he says here, Yuji's role was the vessel, and that's already in place. I think Kenjaku's grand plan was just this merger, this next evolution of cursed energy and humanity, and Sukuna was just a means to that end. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one. As always, let me know y'all's thoughts, and thank you for watching.